Welcome everyone to OASIS Lunchtime Talk, hosted by Game Lab and Centre of Excellence for Game Publishing here at Tampere University. Very proud to announce our guest speaker, Associate Professor Michael Deezer from the Centre of Innovative Methodologies at Warwick University in the UK. He's going to be talking to us today about interface days, and he's asked me to do a little preface and say, like, he was going to play a movie, but he can't, so he's going to have to describe it to you. Okay, using interpretive dance.
Do I need that?
No, you don't.
That's for Q&A.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks everybody here at Tampere Center for Excellence. Sorry, what was it? This is terrible.
Just as long as it's excellent.
Excellent, yes. The Center for Excellence. So I'm at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. And today I'll try just to keep it to 20 minutes. It's very sketchy what I'm going to present, but it is based on some studies that I've completed over the past maybe close to 10 years. A series of studies where I'm looking at interface design, and I see those studies as a contribution to an area of interface critique or interface criticism. I'm at the moment reviewing that work while I'm on sabbatical and seeing whether I can put it together into a book. And so what I thought I'd present today is just a sketch of what that book might look like. I'm very happy to hear any kind of feedback that you would have for me. Some of what I'll present is more concrete. Some of it is loose kind of frames that I'm putting around the work. So I've called the talk Interface Days. It's kind of my working title for the book project. It's a play on the idea of the cinematic gaze. So instead, my suggestion is we have something like the interface days instead of the gaze. And I'll try to explain a little bit what that could be. But I was curious about this moment that you see referenced a lot in, let's say, sort of critical discourse and commentary around digital culture, of people staring into their mobile phones in public. And I thought that's kind of an interesting moment because in a way, from the perspective of social phenomenology, you see something like the exterior of an interface. Oftentimes, interfaces I think they're very hard to grasp holistically. You're sort of either inside an interface, in which case the exterior recedes, or you see an interface in some rare occasions from an exterior, if we're thinking about it as a relation. But still, then you don't see the inside. You don't see, like, what are people really doing there, with their phones? What are they really looking at? And of course, it's not just distraction, as we know from critical theories of distraction. It's both a kind of focused engagement and distraction. So I'm calling it Interface Days as a kind of working title, because I think this exterior perception of the interface can kind of set off a whole range of like processes and engagements that can support critique. That's one reason I'm using that title. And the other one is just because I like this resonance that it has with the idea of like interface days with an S and a Y, like the time you spend with the interface, the time you spend that's lost, and the time that I've spent trying to study interfaces. So in a way to try to put some closure around a period of time where I've been studying them. So why interface critique now? Why use this term critique? Well, I see this, like I said, as a contribution to this domain of interface critique and criticism. And I don't know whether these publications are well known to people, but there's been quite a bit of work coming from a media art perspective. The work of Christian Andersen and Soren Pohl in Denmark is one example. And the online journal Interface Critique is another. So interdisciplinary work, but it really, in my mind, comes through digital aesthetics and media art. And then there's also quite some work in human-computer interaction that is also inspired by, let's say, humanist approaches that incorporate critique. So it's like this interdisciplinary kind of zone, but it's also one that is not always even in dialogue, explicitly with these different sort of areas of interface critique. But anyway, I consider it a contribution to this. But I'm also, I'm very aware of, as many of you are as well, these kind of claims that critique is dead or critique is problematic methodologically as a kind of stance, a position, an orientation. So there's this idea of post-critical or post-critique kind of modes of inquiry. And oftentimes these modes of inquiry want to move towards, there's a lot that I could say about it and that anyone could say about this discourse because it's very complicated and they have some, I think, quite well-founded concerns about particular aspects of performing critique. But there's often a move towards a different mode of engagement that is more productive. If you think of the work of Bruno Latour in his famous essay, Has Critique Run Out of Steam? There's this move towards we should sort of assemble things rather than tear things down or deconstruct them. And there's often a move towards a politics of care as well that's informed by histories of feminist science and technology studies, feminist approaches to technoscience. But having said that, I don't know whether this comes up on screen. There we go. Critique is everywhere. You don't, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that. If you go onto social media, you see critique all the time. In fact, it's full of critique. And also in different forms and sometimes in a kind of what I would call in the form of a critical technical culture. So forms of critique that incorporate technical modes of inquiry. And when I look at that, I think we should maybe investigate critique still, but as a social phenomena and also as a technological phenomena. And I'm quite inspired by the work of Boltanski, the French sociologist who works on the pragmatic sociology of critique. So in a way, it's kind of a response to people like Latour, who, by saying yes, critique is everywhere and distributed in many forms, and some forms, we might sort of question as well the legitimacy of. But shouldn't this also then open up a kind of mode of inquiry into social practice of critique? And one thing that Boltanski does, I think that's quite useful, is pluralizes critique and suggests that there are different forms of critique. So he uses the word testing instead of critique, that you can test things. And the test is a kind of a trial. It's also a moment of judgment. And he labels them different kinds of tests. So for example, I'm going to talk about this very generally because, and if there's anyone who's really into Boltanski, you can feel free to ask me questions or clarify. But if you haven't read, I'm thinking specifically of the text on critique. He suggests these three types. Truth tests, which are in a way a kind of maintenance work. So it's about repairing things, but in a way, the test is, in the moment of critique, the evaluation of it, to sort of maintain the status quo. So you see that something is broken and you fix it, but you don't challenge the status quo. Instead, you sort of reinforce it. I think it opens up a whole range of critical technical practice that's really interesting, right? Based on the repair, maintenance, and upkeep of infrastructures. Then there's a reality test. So reality test goes a little bit further by exposing contradictions between, let's say, the status quo, what he calls reality, so the reality that's produced by institutions, and the world as it's experienced. So the gaps between, how we experience things and what the official cultures are. So this is a bit more of and I think reality test is probably a mode of critique we'd be familiar with in academic research. And then he also says that there's existential tests. So these are like, the reality of institutions does not like accommodate or have space for your experience. So you invent these new modes of, these conditions that will support your experience of the world. And this can open up a lot of artistic domains, aesthetic experimentation, and it's often things like, queer cultures are cited in the context of an existential test where, cultural resources are built up by communities in order to provide, this something like supportive conditions, right? That makes sense for people who are otherwise left out of these official realities. So my suggestion is, though, when I'm reading this work, this is something that's also worth mentioning. There's also a kind of alienation of critique that I think is something Boltanski writes about, but I think is more relevant than ever. When we go online and we see, the spread of conspiratorial thinking. So this is a moment where he says, the institutional confirmation of the critique and the contestations, they're very unbalanced. So people have grievances, they're not able to adequately express those grievances, and they're certainly not adequately accounted for within the institutional cultures. So you see this kind of form of an alienated critique emerge, which can be conspiratorial and very retrograde in many cases. One thing that I'm curious about, though, is that in this work, he talks a lot about semantics and pragmatics. Those are his two modes. It makes sense because Boltanski is a poet and a sociologist. So he's interested in language and practice, social practice. But he doesn't talk about techniques. He's not really like a hacker or a tinkerer, and certainly is not somebody who sort of is contemporaneous with what we might call a digital culture. So I'm wondering what happens if you would add techniques to Boltanski's work. So you have this third form. And so I'm interested in how critique has been transformed as a recursive practice with a technical milieu. This is the fancy way of saying it. But basically, when you bring techniques into a process by recursion, I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, but like a movement where you're reflecting and incorporating in technology. And my suggestion is here not that I'm saying this is what critique should be. I'm saying that critique already is this, because there are so many examples of how it's practiced in this way. So this is the social influence from Boltanski. It's more like we maybe haven't adequately theorized it. But you could disagree. Maybe there's many examples of people that have. Okay, so this is my next theory slide, and then I'll get into some examples. So, but I want to say, like, if you take this approach to the interface, there's some challenges. And the challenges are that the interface is what I'm calling techno-fluid. So first of all, there's some books there that I'm influenced by, or that I'm reading through at the moment, to kind of put a theory frame around the work, some of the studies that I've done. And I was going to show you a video, but I'll explain the video in a second. So first of all, what do I mean by critique? I've given you these examples from Boltanski. But I want to suggest that in Boltanski's 3 modes, there's something like a movement occurring. In a way, we can think of those modes together. And the movement is recursive. So it basically is a transformative movement, which in its full actualization, so in its full movement, it involves a thinking that returns to itself, and it's individuating. So it's not a circular movement, and it's not arithmetic in the sense of like a subtraction. So it's not like I oppose something, I'm anti, and it's also not a synthesis in the sense of 1 + 1 = 2 or 1 + 2 = 3. It's a spiral. So in being recursive, it transforms your initial starting point. It changes who you are, it changes the conditions of the problem. And so here I'm really interested, influenced by the work of Yuk Hoi. So it's this kind of spiraling movement that I'm really interested in when it comes to critique and how technology can be brought into that. The problem is that our interfaces and technologies also kind of work this way. So of course, recursive algorithms is the first thing you may think of. But a lot of the experience of the interface has a kind of fluidity to it that takes us, I'm suggesting, beyond immersion or distraction and into something that I'm calling submersion. Like you're submerged into like water, for example. And the reason I think this happens is because a lot of the systems, a lot of our techniques, they mimic the movement of critique through feedback. And this leads to an entanglement of feedback, recursion, and reflexivity. So this might sound all very conceptual, theoretical, but it's just some very practical problems that emerge when you research interfaces. So for instance, if you want to research social media interface and there's a high level of personalization going on because there's personalized algorithms that are profiling the user behavior and feeding particular content, but it might not just be even content, but also the form of that content. It could even be like, how the content is structured and presented on the user interface. So that could be an example, right, where this kind of fluidity of the interface becomes a problem for critique. But I think it happens in other ways too. I think it can become difficult to understand what is a moment of incorporation and transformation. So by that, I mean, I don't even know whether we always have adequate theories, critical theories, to describe the difference between something just being sort of captured and in a way neutralized, a critique. It's just absorbed. And when that absorption of critique is genuinely transformative, it can be in a mode of reform, but also maybe even a revolutionary way. And I think also algorithmic incorporation and feedback, yeah, it means that this is even more complicated again. So in all of this, like the way I'm thinking about interfaces at the moment is as a kind of a vortex. So you enter into these spiraling relations and you're kind of spun out of them again. And there's a kind of moment where you're outside of this spiral, you perform it, you're in it, and then it dissipates. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it at the moment. It's also this idea of technofluidity I'm interested in because it's part of the language of digital culture, right? If we think about the fact that we're doing a stream right now, if we think about flows of data, if we think about, like I had this video that I wanted to show, but it's a sizzle reel created by OpenAI. It basically is a reel that explains to third parties who want to use their branding how they should use it properly. and it explains their brand identity. And in the midst of this video, after it goes through typography and some layouts, it just starts showing these images of water and the beach and waves crashing and cloud formations. So there's a history here that maybe some of you have researched or looked into as well of the influence of fluid dynamics historically on information and how information is sort of informed by this history. So there's a deep genealogy. There's a reason why I think these metaphors are used over and over again. But I'm also trying to pick up those metaphors and those histories in order to explain what this does to behavior and how it transforms critique. Okay, I think this is sort of the theory part done. Oh yeah, and I think this is really important too for some of those critical histories of attention and distraction. My suggestion is when you're in this vortex of the interface, when you're in this situation of technofluidity, there's a saturation of attention. It's not a loss. It's like an overwhelming of attention. And a good example here, I was reading Soren Pold and Ben Grosser's new article that I'll reference quickly. Oh, I'm already 20 minutes in, got to rush. This always happens. Where they're talking about ChatGPT, you know.
Michael, you don't have to rush because we've got an hour.
Okay, but I'm behind where I thought I would be.
You don't have to rush.
But I'm also getting through the worst parts of it. Like, you know, when you use ChatGPT, it floods you with these responses, right? All these dot points, all of this text. You know, and they write about that in terms of a kind of a hyper aesthetics. Like it's constantly kind of, and I think that can also be thought about as the saturation of attention. Like if you use ChatGPT for like, you know, even 10 minutes, you can generate literally thousands and thousands of words, right? It often becomes a case of like trying to reduce rather than, you know, generate text. You know, that's the kind of mode you're in because it's overwhelming. Yeah, so what's important to me is that the interface is a kind of relation, it's performative, it complicates critique, but it has still this form to it. And, you know, the Hookway's book, which is a very frustrating book in so many ways, but for better or worse, it has been an influence on me. Just very quickly, one thing that I'm really struck by in that book is he at one point he declares there is no counter interface. There's no way to counter an interface. It's kind of a separate part of another talk that I could give, but also stuck with my head. So I'm trying to figure out if we accept this as maybe how interfaces work in relation to critique, and I'm happy if you don't. I'd love to hear why. And I don't even think that this is necessarily watertight. This is just how I'm thinking about it at the moment. If we accept this, then I think that there are three ways that we can counter this kind of vortex of forces. One of them is to situate the interface within a broader setting, the milieu, in order to recognize that there's a before and an after. There's an anticipation and an aftermath. The second is to think about interfaces in relation to each other. There's not just one interface. You know, there's an ecology of interfaces. I'm going to hopefully be able to show you concretely why I think these points are worth making. And then finally, just cut off the screen, that there is a need, or there's the possibility to establish different rapports with interfaces by drawing on this broader environment and on this ecology. So by rapport, obviously, I'm kind of trying to riff on two different meanings in that word. One of them is like a dialogue, and the other is kind of to build up something material, like a rampart, you know, or a scaffolding. And this is to bring in the technical. Okay. But gosh, there's maybe is one more theory thing. But this is basically what I'm going to run through now. I'm not going to talk through this table at the moment in a lot of detail. I'll just try to illustrate it. But the way I'm thinking about the book, other than that kind of theory moment, is just running through 4 chapters of 4 different kinds of interface critique. One of them is prefigurative. This is like, you know, the anticipation, like the bits that happen before you perform the interface. Looking at that moment, the pre-interface, the prefiguration of the interface. Second is diagnostic. You're in the interface, right? You're in the vortex. And how is that, like, how can you study it when you're in the interface? Augmentation. This is a moment where I was talking before about using interfaces to study other interfaces. So using interfaces in an ecology. And the synthetic, this is actually something that I'm just starting on, a bit late. But it's the AI moment, and what difference does AI make? And this is probably, unfortunately, if you're really looking forward to me saying anything about AI, this is the most sketchy. So the first, what do I mean by this prefigurative, the pre-interface, the anticipatory? I'm looking at like if you remember, I wanted to say that critique is always social. So part of what I'm doing is not trying to invent critique from scratch, but trying to look where interface critique already exists in a set of practices, including practices of maintenance and repair, practices of like critique in a kind of stronger sense of looking at contradictions, and also critique in the sense of inventing alternatives, the existential critique. And in the world of UX, has anyone heard of this? I'm sure some of you have, the idea of the design pattern. Yeah, right. Very well known. It comes from this book originally in the 1970s, Christopher Alexander. It was a book where basically he wrote a catalog of recipes for how urban space could be designed. So it has all these patterns in it, like recipes that you can follow. Like, you know, you should always have a public park, you know, within this amount of distance from residential housing. You should restrict height of buildings so that they're only like 4 stories. And there's a lot that can be said about that book. But anyway, this is where it comes from. And it ended up being much more of an inspiration on software development than architecture. Its status within architecture at the time was heavily contested and critiqued. But it ended up informing a lot of software development, where the idea is that if you want to build a particular software application, there are recipes that you can follow. You know, there are particular ways of doing things that can be relatively formalized, and those are patterns. Another kind of echo here is also the idea of like patterns in weaving, you know, which also goes, of course, into the history of computation. Yeah, it was massively influential for interface design. The first ever wiki was this one prior to Wikipedia. It's called Common Ground, and it was a pattern language for interface design. And that ended up being sort of formalized again into a book. But a lot of these user interface patterns are now like sort of automated and or formalized and semi-automated into UI libraries. So these are libraries of components and also techniques that developers draw from in order to build software. So for example, Material UI is a library that's been produced inspired by Google's Material Design Manifesto. That's quite widely used. Alibaba has a UI library called Ant Design that's kind of interesting. But yeah, there's many. And these libraries follow something like Alexander's work in that they contain a set of principles, like political kind of like manifesto-like statements about good design. And then they include recipes. And in the library form of these kits, they will often have like practical components work in code, and other elements, including graphic elements like sliders, buttons, things that you can put into your interface. So I'm suggesting, like, this whole kind of prefiguration of the interface is also a space of critique. Probably most obviously in the idea of dark patterns, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. But the dark pattern is a riff, right, on design pattern. It's to create a library of manipulative techniques in UI that use behavioral design principles in order to, instead of like empower the user, in order to withdraw agency from the user and sort of trap them into, you know, different commercial scams, basically. So it was, what fascinated me about this dark patterns concept when I encountered it is that it didn't come from necessarily the world of like critical media theory. It came from a practitioner's perspective, which again, the social practice of technical critique. And it's become massively influential. And so we took inspiration from this to develop a game. This is actually one of my rare links back to game studies. So we did this for teaching. Oh, I don't know whether I have the image down below. But essentially, we created a deck of cards. Cards are also another format where you see design patterns sort of put together. It's a reskinned Uno game, but it all works on dark patterns. And the idea is you need to disconnect from social media by getting rid of your cards. And the cards are dark patterns. Okay. Yeah, this is something else that I'm looking into recently is permissions in apps as a kind of infrastructural interface. So for when you use an app, right, sometimes you get these prompts that say like, it wants to access your contacts. It wants to access your microphone. So these are like techno-legalistic moments of consent. And they're all deliberately designed, some of them, for this pop-up interface. And those are called, for instance, in the Android system, a dangerous permission, in that they require direct user consent. But there's a whole load of other permissions that you consent to just by downloading the app. And those are also formalized in the code in a document called the manifest within apps. So these are like interfaces in the background, and they open up a whole range of data flows to the device, to distant infrastructure. So they support datafication. So I've done some studies on apps where I'm looking at these kind of permissions, but I see this as also in a way a kind of prefiguration of the interface. These are the conditions of possibility, right, that you need to consent to in entering that interface relation with the app. And some of which you're conscious of, and some of which you're less conscious of. And this image here, so what we've done is there are these ways of studying apps historically by using app repositories. So there are places you can go and download old versions of apps. And we're looking at the development here of WeChat as a super app over time and the amount of permissions that it requests or that are embedded into it. So a classic like signature of super appification is this accumulation of permissions, right? Because a super app wants to be a platform. So it needs more permissions to basically run as an operating system. So it's going to ask more and more access of your device and more processes of datafication. So this is basically what you see in this image. So in a way, I see this as also a kind of mode of interface critique, but it's one that works in a prefigurative way. Let's try to get through the next in 5 minutes. I don't know whether that's possible. Diagnostic critique. This is the moment now where you're like using the interface. Another way to make this distinction between prefigurative and diagnostic that's a little maybe more straightforward or clear static analysis versus dynamic. Static in the sense of like you're just looking at how it's coded, designed. Dynamic, you're using it. And there's also really important methodological kind of considerations between a dynamic and static analysis. But there's basically two different ways that I have looked at this dynamic diagnostic critique. One is doing walkthroughs. If you're familiar with this walkthrough method that's become influential in digital media studies, it's basically just using an app and documenting screen by screen, but a probably better way to think about it is what they call in the industry touch point by touch point. So moments where the user has to make a decision. And you can document this in different ways. It can be simply doing screen capture as you move through the app, or it could even be any software really. But you can also do quantitative analysis by counting things as you go through what's called a user journey, for those of you who have studied the more commercial side of software development. So you take the user on a journey, and there are different moments along that journey, and you could also count them and quantify them. So this is an example of a quantified walkthrough of dating apps, which is super fascinating. I wish I had more time to talk about it, but it's by my colleague Esther Veltefrede in Amsterdam, and she was also working with some other people. I did one with a colleague, Nathaniel Tkach, where we looked at banking apps and what the journey is to like set up a bank account and how they verify your identity. And we built what we called a walkthrough explorer to do our analysis that also allowed us to do both quali-quant, so quantitative and qualitative study of how these user journeys are managed and when they request personal sensitive data from users and how they do it, which led to this article in Computational Culture. But this is like, dynamic critique of the user interface, right? There's another more technical side of this, which is to look into the background of what's happening on, like, if the walkthrough is on the level of signs, this is on a level of signals, the infrastructural backend, and what's happening on that side. And this gets into things for me about timing and latency. So I don't know whether anybody's looked into this kind of stuff. There's obviously an immense literature in media theory about time and also a sociology of time. But on an industry level, there's this idea that like you want to always have an interface loading in the present. And the present is about 3 seconds. 3 seconds is the phenomenological like envelope through which we develop memory. And it's basically like if you wait more than 3 seconds for this page to load, you may open another tab, right? And start doing something else. And you see that explicitly in what they measure as conversion rates. Conversion is basically you want to move the user from one side of a decision to the other. You want to convert them. And you see this huge drop in conversion when latency becomes too high. So one thing we were interested in is measuring the loading times of advertisements and tracking and how that coincides with organic content or not. And this is a study that I did with an artist and theorist, David Gauthier. And we basically looked at news websites and how they handle user tracking based on this 3-second window of conversion. And in some cases, there's some very interesting techniques where they manage to track users before, sort of in subliminal ways, really. I'll just mention very quickly, like I'm interested in how this question of latency is transformed in the context of AI, because it's a huge issue of like how long it takes for processing of a prompt, to return a result. And for those of you who are using ChatGPT 5, you will have noticed the way that they handle this is through an automated cycling through different models based on the query type. and they also give you this kind of waiting prompt where they say, I'm thinking. So there's something interesting here about it like becoming like some kind of cognitive agent. And there's a whole range of critical discourse online around models being too slow and them being dumb, right? And there's also some interesting things that happen around voice AI and latency, because the timing can become uncanny, and you want to kind of like find this different phenomenological window as well for like what would be considered natural conversation. So this is an area that's a bit sketchy for me at the moment, but I'm thinking of working on. This is my second last slide. Two other areas. I mentioned augmented critique and synthetic critique. I mentioned this idea of using one interface to critique another. My example here is plugins, especially the whole plugin economy around browsers. So I'm sure some of you have used plugins in your time, but some of them have become really important for social science research and digital sociology. So the idea of having a plugin, for instance, that can just scrape all of the links on a website, or can pull down all of the images. You know, so these are what used to be called user scripts, where the user would transform the interface away from its normative functioning. They would create not an ordinary interface, but an extraordinary interface. So they would apply like one kind of interfacing to another, if that makes sense. There's a lot of artistic plugins, but there's also the whole kind of idea of ad blocking, right? Ad blocking as a technical critique of targeted advertising on the web. So it's also in this mode, I would say, of an augmented critique of the interface. And then finally, there's synthetic critique. And this mainly, I think, works around prompting. A really good article, I think I mentioned at the top of this talk, is by Soren Pold and Ben Grosser that's just been published, where they look at the sycophantic texts that are generated out of ChatGPT in order just to get you to continue chatting. So they look at how there's something like user experience embedded into the textual output that says like, what an amazing idea that you've had by asking me this. And then it finishes the output by saying, would you like me to do something more for you? You know, so this is a kind of like, you know, to entice users to give up more and more information. And they write about this in that article. I'm sorry I don't have the reference. But I also want to suggest that this is a huge practice in user communities, as I'm sure you all know. Prompt critique. It's also used in digital sociology and digital methods. But just this week, I don't know whether anyone encountered this kind of meme of like asking large language models, is there an emoji for a seahorse? And for some reason, it just freaks out. And it can't handle this request. It can actually lead to infinite regress in the model. And I'm sure if you did it right now, because I checked it last night, it was still, they still haven't fixed it. But this is just one example, right, of prompt critique where people are kind of probing the limits of these models. Okay. So conclusion. My point here is that interface critique is social and technical. It can lead us from a recognition of alienated forms of critique to critical technical cultures. I'm suggesting that to critique the interface means to engage in recursion, which incorporates all of these elements of design, data, cognition, care. I've also been arguing that the technical milieus are not our objects of analysis here, but they're transformative, they're sites of individuation. And the way critique operates technically, if we bring in techniques to our social understanding of critique, is by composing a kind of rapport with the interface along these different kind of forms. I didn't really mention much about existential critique and this idea of techno-diversity, like diversifying our infrastructures, actually building alternatives. But this is something that I'm also interested in with my research. I'm part of a network called StreamArt Network, which is a group of collectives that do streaming. but we experiment with the possibilities of streaming by moving into federated infrastructures, by opening up the aesthetics of streaming towards like, yeah, let's say sort of more psychedelic possibilities, but also looking at it in terms of individuation, like hybrid togetherness and a kind of aesthetics of hope core, like looking for hope when it comes to our digital infrastructures, which currently feel so sort of dystopian. Yeah, so I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I didn't talk much about game studies.
Oh,
but
yeah, well.
I just mentioned one thing quickly though. Digital Foundry, that YouTube channel, they basically do latency analysis. But maybe that you guys were thinking that. But that's, I think, a good example of that channel moves between like, I guess, reality test and truth test. Like sometimes they just look at it just from an instrumental perspective, like, you know, which one has the highest frame rates. But at other points, they'll go into a more like sharper critique about particular platforms and companies and commercial decisions that have been made that affect the aesthetic experience. But anyway, that's one link that I thought I would mention.
Well, thanks, Michael. Obviously, all the questions are going to be based on game studies and why did you acquire games and
Yes, yeah.
So like, it's good that you anticipated that. I can see that Thomas has already got a question like, about urban Gotham maybe, but I'll just pass it on to him. We're going to have a short question time now.
Handing it over. Thank you for this. This was a very, very interesting. One question going back to what you mentioned about the user journey kind of question. So that's a very mechanistic way of looking at it. A lot of service designers, for instance, would probably argue that a lot of the, or even the main part of decision making happens in between the touch points. So are you using something to capture those moments as well, or following the technically documentable procedure only?
Yeah. So I've worked with the walkthrough in that paper where we had very specific questions around how UX techniques were used to smooth over these, let's say, well, to use the language in industry, these friction points of people, and not just in a small way, right? Like doing things like uploading photographs of your passport and participating in voice recognition. And so some pretty like, you know, heavy, I think, moments for UX and how they were sort of trying to handle that. So I think in that study, it was relatively contained, but that method, so it's an article originally for digital media studies written by Light et al. But the techniques of walkthroughs go all the way back into HCI. In some case, in the cognitive walkthrough, very, very much based around usability. Walkthroughs are also, I think, part of popular culture, of course, as we all know from gaming. So there's many examples of walkthroughs. I think some can be quite mechanistic, some of them less so. And I think it depends on what questions you're asking. In that piece that Light and his co-authors have produced, they have this kind of funny moment where they set up a framework where they say that you need to look at the environment of expected use. And that goes beyond the interface itself. It goes into looking at the business model of this service. They're talking specifically about apps, so most of them are commercial. And looking at just all of these kind of what we might think of as paratextual resources. And you know, I've read critiques of that as well, saying like that sort of is, it seems like most of the walkthrough is not in the walkthrough. Because one thing they want to do is bracket users. So maybe you know as well, if you've worked in HCI or industry, a lot of it incorporates user research. You know, you watch the users do the walkthrough, you see where they fail, or you interview users about their experience of the journey and so on. So they try to bracket that, which I think can lead to also, yeah, these kind of moments of these methodological problems that you're indicating. So, and that's something that, you know, in the chapter, I hope to kind of reflect more about. Yeah, there's something interesting too, like the researcher has to perform the walkthrough. So who are you when you're doing that walkthrough? And there's a proposal that you have to develop like a research persona. And there's very explicit reasons why you do that. Like if you have to do a social login to proceed in the walkthrough, then you basically have to have you know, a research profile set up to do the login. So who are you? You know, right? There's like a performative moment. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity to it, I think. I think people take it for granted that this is like a straightforward way of studying interfaces, and it's insanely complicated, especially students. Students think like, oh, this will be easy. I just have to do some screen captures. I don't have to do anything too technical. And it's like, no. It's like really, yeah, really hard to do it well.
Okay, I've got a question down here from Dr. Blum. What's that?
If there are other questions.
Oh, well, I saw yours first. So
Does anyone study gaming walkthroughs, by the way? I imagine that's like how does a player, where do they decide to go in the game, and how do they, especially in open worlds, I imagine that's quite contentious. Anyway.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to go back to this idea of submersion, right? Instead of like the focus that you specified or the distraction. And I was thinking it seems similar yet different to this idea of immersion. So I was wondering what you think for you in the idea of like submersion is the difference there between like immersion into these technologies and interfaces, or the submersion that you're speaking about.
Yeah, so I just started looking a bit into that. Like, where does the discourse of immersion, where does that really come from? Like in digital culture. And of course, yeah, virtual reality is one of the places. And especially, I looked and it was around like 1992, 1993 that the term immersion really starts to take off in human-computer interaction. And it's because I think around that time at one of the SIGGRAPH conferences, a whole range of virtual reality setups were demoed. So virtual reality is one place, and then it kind of migrates into some, but not all aspects of ubiquitous computing. So I don't have like a solid response because I'm still kind of looking a bit into that. But my sense is that with immersion, it's still a discourse around like that the user is somehow either empowered or it's a transcendent experience of some kind. Whereas submersion, I see more as a much more an experience that's threatening for the user's agency and subjectivity. So it's closer to drowning than swimming.
Right, as more questions. Oh, you got my mic, okay.
I want to maybe move a bit closer to games.
Yeah.
There is quite a big number by now of games that one way or another at some stage or fully are basically either mockery or just user interface where a player does something within the app or interacts with an in-game app. And although some of them approach it with a bit of at least like mockery, trying to say that is bullshit, there are games that like seriously show that we are playing the app in which something happens. Would you consider the very emergence of this as subgenre, subtype as a critique of us living in the world full of interfaces, basically, or rather just as a response to the fact that we every day in our life see and interact with user interfaces?
It's hard for me to respond because I don't know exactly the game you're talking about or the games. I don't know whether you want to say more, but I'm interested in what you're saying. I think just as a quick response, I think that there are, obviously I'm focused more in the world of social media apps and now these AI services. And I don't really have, I think, any examples from games. But I think that there are so many, because game culture is such a vibrant, like critical technical culture. I think there's so many examples. And I think of this idea of augmented critique in terms of like the whole idea of modding, you know, which is done in critical and artistic registers, as we know. And now there's a long history of that. But I'm sure there's many other examples. Yeah, I mean, this is a cliche, but I also, I think of the games of, oh man.
Yeah. Paulo, what's his name?
Oh, I mean, there's that, but I also just think of Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah, the one with you switch around thing and.
Yeah, the switch around thing,
Yeah.
but there's also a moment in Metal Gear Solid 4 where Snake, if you play for too long, basically tells you you've been playing too long. You know, so who's the name of the director again? He's always doing these Brechtian moments when it comes to the critique. That's to the interface. And I'm sure there's many, you know, he's an obvious like auteur, but I'm sure there's many examples of this in gaming, right? That are, but sorry, can you tell me about your example quickly?
It might not be quick, so we can discuss. It might be not a very quick list because I have plenty of, starting with all the streaming related games and games like Don't Feed the Monkeys, which is basically camera interfaces.
Yeah.
I'm happy to share the list of examples later because I just happen to encounter them on a regular basis nowadays that are like mostly interaction with camera interfaces, but not only them.
Yeah. And because I have to apologize because I'm not a game studies person, so I'm sorry if I'm like, some of my references are really dusty. But there's also this magic circle idea, right? That is also part of gaming. And I encountered a game recently that I was like, this is a risky game because it's constantly putting the interface and the magic circle into question, which was, it was this card game where you pull cards out and you have to do things with your phone. And one of them is like, you have to send a message to somebody and whoever gets the message back the fastest like wins that round. But like all of the things were like that. So that was a moment where I was also like, you know, is there some kind of interface critique going on here that's also playing with the boundaries of, you know, a game and what's in the game and outside the game and what's social, you said there are like Goffman people here, social breaching. Is this like a, you know, the gamification of social breaching?
We'll never get to go to lunch, Michael.
Don't bring up Goffman?
Yeah. Right. Hey, thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for the amazing talk. Folks, there's not a bit of time for any questions. It's like right now on the hour. But I'm going to be taking Michael to a classic Tampere eatery, Tapola. And we're leaving from the foyer there in 10 minutes. You're very much welcome to join us.
And thanks so much, everyone, for listening to my sketchy ideas. And if you have any feedback for me, Google me, send me an email, please, because I'm trying to put together this book. You know, would you like to read such a book? Do you think that there's a better book than the one that I'm sketching, or anything else that I could include? Please, including your critiques, send them along.
Yeah, or tell them about Tapola.